Most people hear the name Sun Tzu and instantly picture swords, generals, smoke-filled battlefields, and a quote reposted by someone selling hustle courses. He's been turned into a mascot for aggression, a patron saint of domination, confidence, and ruthless winning. To modern audiences, the art of war feels like a manual for conquest, a philosophical permission slip to overpower rivals, but that image is deeply misleading because if you actually read Sun Tzu carefully, not as a motivational poster, not as a strategy meme, but as a thinker responding to the collapse of states, you discover something almost uncomfortable. Sun Tzu wasn't obsessed with victory, he was obsessed with survival. And more specifically, he was obsessed with what war does to a nation's finances. Strip away the poetry and the legend, and Sun Tzu begins to look less like a warrior philosopher and more like something far rarer in history. A strategist who understood that the fastest way to destroy a state isn't losing a battle, it's winning too many expensive ones. This is cash Repux, where money, power, and history collide, and where the real story is always hidden beneath the surface. To understand Sun Tzu's brilliance, you first have to understand the world that produced him. His ideas didn't emerge in a vacuum. They were forged inside a system already cracking under its own weight. A world at war with its own balance sheet. Sun Tzu lived during a brutal transition in Chinese history, the late spring and autumn period sliding into the early warring states era, roughly between the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. This wasn't a time of heroic clashes between noble warriors. It was an age of systemic exhaustion. China was fractured into rival states, each convinced it was destined to unify the realm. None could afford to stop fighting, and none could afford to keep fighting either. Alliances were temporary, betrayals were routine, borders shifted constantly, and with every campaign, treasuries bled. War was no longer an occasional event, it had become permanent policy. Armies were growing larger every generation. The old aristocratic style of warfare, chariots, elite nobles, ritualized combat, was collapsing. In its place emerged mass infantry forces that required unprecedented levels of coordination, taxation, and production. States had to feed tens of thousands of soldiers, equip them with standardized weapons, move them across long distances, pay administrators, engineers, craftsmen, armorers, cooks, and laborers. War was no longer a clash of elites. It was an industrial operation, centuries before the Industrial Revolution. Every time a ruler ordered an army to march, he wasn't just issuing a command, he was borrowing against the future. Crops left unharvested, labor pulled from farms, taxes raised, debt accumulated in ways ancient societies barely understood. And those debts didn't always get repaid. Many states didn't fall because they were conquered. They fell because they ran out of money first. War is an economic trap. Modern audiences often imagine ancient war as crude and simple. In reality, it was brutally complex and unforgiving to those who miscalculated cost. The moment an army moved, expenses exploded. Grain had to be transported. Animals had to be fed. Equipment had to be repaired. Soldiers had to be supplied continuously. Distance multiplied cost. Time multiplied cost even faster. A short campaign could strain a treasury, a long one could destroy it. Sun Tzu understood something his contemporaries refused to admit. War had become an economic stress test, and most states were failing it. Kings believed their greatest danger was the enemy's army. Sun Tzu believed their greatest danger was their own spending habits. That insight alone makes him revolutionary. Sun Tzu, the risk analyst. We like to imagine Sun Tzu as a mystical thinker speaking in riddles. In reality, he reads more like a risk manager forced to explain unpleasant truths to leaders who didn't want to hear them. Where others spoke of honor, courage, and glory, Sun Tzu spoke of sustainability. Where others chased decisive battles, Sun Tzu asked, how long can you afford this? What happens after? What does victory cost? He wasn't trying to build empires fueled by constant conquest. He was trying to stop states from committing slow financial suicide. This is why the art of war opens the way it does. Sun Tzu doesn't begin with tactics or heroics, he begins with a warning. War is a matter of vital importance to the state, not noble, not glorious. Vital, meaning existential, dangerous, and capable of destroying the very society that wages it. From the first line, he frames war not as a test of bravery, but as a liability. Avoiding battle was the point. Sun Tzu's most famous line is often misunderstood. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. People read this as wisdom, or philosophy, or psychological depth, but it's far more concrete than that. It's cost avoidance. Winning without fighting means no prolonged supply lines, no drained treasuries, no shattered labor base, no post-war economic collapse. It's the ancient equivalent of achieving your objective without burning capital. Sun Tzu wasn't arguing that battle was immoral. He was arguing that battle was expensive, and worse, often unnecessary. Logistics were the real battlefield throughout the art of war. Sun Tzu shows a strange lack of interest in combat itself. Instead, he obsesses over logistics, supply, distance, and time. He explains that transporting grain over long distances multiplies cost dramatically. He warns that armies living off their own supply lines weaken the state faster than they weaken the enemy. He points out that when soldiers are in the field, farmers aren't farming. When labor is mobilized for war, production collapses at home. This isn't poetic philosophy, it's macroeconomics. Sun Tzu understood that a nation fighting to long doesn't just risk defeat, it risks internal decay, rebellion, famine, loss of legitimacy, collapse, and once that happens, no battlefield victory can save you. Intelligence was cheaper than armies. Sun Tzu's emphasis on spies and information is often framed as cunning or cleverness. But again, the logic is financial. A single spy could prevent an army from marching in the wrong direction. A single piece of intelligence could save months of wasted campaigning. One accurate report could spare an entire state from ruin. Foreknowledge, in Sun Tzu's language, is simply data. He understood that ignorance is expensive and misinformation, even more so. Today we call this efficiency. He called it wisdom. Speed was about cost control. When Sun Tzu says, speed is the essence of war, most readers imagine aggression. That's not what he meant. Speed reduces exposure. Speed lowers cost. Speed limits uncertainty. Every extra day in the field increases expense and risk. Every delay compounds financial strain. Sun Tzu wasn't urging reckless attacks. He was advocating economic discipline. Win quickly or don't fight at all. War is a balance sheet. What makes Sun Tzu unique in world history is that he treated war like an accounting problem. Every decision had a price. Every action carried opportunity cost. Every campaign closed off cheaper alternatives to him. War wasn't a test of masculinity or honor. It was a line item. And rulers who enjoyed war for its own sake, he warned, would eventually bankrupt their kingdoms. That warning proved prophetic. History repeats the pattern. The pattern Sun Tzu identified never disappeared. Empires have collapsed not because their soldiers lacked courage, but because their economies couldn't sustain prolonged conflict. The Soviet Union in Afghanistan, the United States in Vietnam, European powers in World War I, these wars weren't lost on the battlefield alone. They were lost in budgets, supply chains, debt, and public exhaustion. Sun Tzu would have recognized every one of them. Sun Tzu in the modern world. Modern warfare looks different, but the logic is the same. Cyber operations instead of armies, sanctions instead of sieges, proxy wars instead of invasions, intelligence instead of attrition. All our attempts to achieve outcomes without incurring catastrophic cost. Sun Tzu's fingerprints are everywhere, because his real lesson wasn't about how to fight, it was about when not to. The final insight: Sun Tzu didn't teach rulers how to conquer the world. He taught them how to avoid destroying themselves. He understood that the cost of conflict lingers long after the fighting ends, in debt, instability, and weakened institutions. States don't usually fail because they lose wars. They fail because they can't afford the ones they win. That's why The Art of War isn't a book about aggression. It's a book about restraint, about patience, about economic survival. Strength, in Sun Tzu's world, isn't measured by how hard you strike. It's measured by how long you can endure. History doesn't repeat, but the bill always comes due. If this changed how you see power, war, and money, subscribe. History already wrote the lessons. Here at Repux, we just read the fine print.